What do you say to a man you once trusted with the fate of the free world when he turns his back on you in your darkest hour? This question haunted Harry S. Truman in the winter of 1952, when Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general he had elevated to supreme command, the man he had considered a friend, refused to defend him against the most vicious political attacks of the Cold War era. The tension between these two titans of American history reached its breaking point not on a battlefield, but in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., where loyalty, legacy, and the truth itself became casualties of political ambition. On November 18, 1952, just 2 weeks after Eisenhower's landslide electoral victory, Truman invited the president-elect to the White House for what should have been a cordial transition meeting. Instead, it became one of the coldest encounters in presidential history. The air in the Oval Office was thick with unspoken accusations and barely concealed contempt. Eisenhower arrived with his advisors, his posture military straight, but his expression distant, almost dismissive. Truman, smaller in stature but enormous in presence, stood behind his desk, the famous sign reading, "The buck stops here," positioned pointedly in view. What transpired in that room would define not just the relationship between two presidents, but the very nature of accountability in American leadership. The roots of their confrontation stretched back through years of decisions that had shaped the post-war world, from the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 to the bloody stalemate in Korea that was still claiming American lives daily in 1952. If you're finding this glimpse into one of history's most dramatic presidential confrontations compelling, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that like button so you never miss these untold stories of power, betrayal, and consequence. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand how leadership and accountability have shaped our world, and drop a comment below telling us what surprised you most about this encounter between two giants of the 20th century. The story begins not with their falling out, but with their partnership, forged in the crucible of World War II when Truman, as president following Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, made the monumental decision to appoint Eisenhower as the public face of Allied victory. Truman had chosen Eisenhower over more senior generals like Douglas MacArthur, recognizing in the Kansas-born officer a political acumen that matched his military skill. It was Truman who had supported Eisenhower's appointment as Supreme Commander of NATO in December 1950, entrusting him with the defense of Western Europe against Soviet expansion. It was Truman who had praised Eisenhower publicly and privately, who had considered him a potential successor, who had even suggested in 1951 that Eisenhower might run for president as a Democrat. The relationship was built on mutual respect, on shared experiences of leading America through existential crises, on the understanding that both men, in their different roles, bore the crushing weight of decisions that would echo through generations. But beneath this surface harmony, fundamental differences were growing. Differences in temperament, in political philosophy, and most critically, in their understanding of what a leader owed to the truth when confronted with politically inconvenient facts. Eisenhower was a master of consensus, a builder of coalitions who understood the value of strategic ambiguity and the political necessity of sometimes remaining silent. Truman was blunt, direct, constitutionally incapable of dodging responsibility, a man who believed that honesty, even brutal honesty, was the only currency that mattered in leadership. The breaking point came during the 1952 presidential campaign, specifically over the issue that had become the Republican Party's most potent weapon against Truman. The accusation that his administration was soft on communism, that it had lost China to Mao Zedong's communist forces in 1949, and that it was riddled with Soviet spies and sympathizers. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin had been making these charges since his infamous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, on February 9, 1950, when he claimed to have a list of communists working in the State Department. McCarthy's crusade had destroyed careers, created a climate of paranoia, and turned communist sympathizer into the era's most devastating accusation. Eisenhower, running as the Republican nominee, needed McCarthy's support and the support of the Republican right wing that McCarthy represented. But McCarthy had also launched vicious attacks against George C. Marshall, Truman's former Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, the architect of the Marshall Plan that had rebuilt Europe, and most significantly, the man who had been Eisenhower's mentor and patron throughout his military career. Marshall had recommended Eisenhower for promotion time and again, had chosen him to lead the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, had shaped his entire career. Now McCarthy was calling Marshall a traitor, part of a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. And Eisenhower, who owed Marshall everything, remained silent. The moment that shattered Truman's respect for Eisenhower came on October 3, 1952, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state. Eisenhower's campaign team had prepared a speech that included a strong defense of Marshall, a paragraph that explicitly praised his character and service. Eisenhower had approved this language, had planned to deliver it knowing it would anger McCarthy and his supporters. But as the campaign train rolled toward Milwaukee, with McCarthy himself aboard as a guest of honor, Eisenhower's political advisors pressured him to remove the defense of Marshall. They argued it would be politically awkward to praise Marshall while standing next to McCarthy, that it would alienate crucial conservative voters, that it would dominate news coverage and distract from Eisenhower's broader message. On that train, in those hours of deliberation, Eisenhower made a choice that would define his relationship with Truman forever. He deleted the paragraph defending Marshall. He stood on that stage in Milwaukee, with McCarthy beaming beside him, and said nothing to counter the accusations against the man who had made his career possible. When news of this deletion reached Truman in the White House on October 4, 1952, his reaction was volcanic. Truman, who had built his political identity on loyalty, who had stood by subordinates even when it cost him politically, who had fired the wildly popular Douglas MacArthur in April 1951 because MacArthur had defied civilian authority, could not comprehend how Eisenhower could betray Marshall so completely. Truman's private comments to his staff were scorching and unfiltered, captured in diary entries and memoirs that reveal the depth of his fury. He called Eisenhower's silence one of the most shameful things I've ever witnessed, said that the general had betrayed his mentor for political expediency, and declared that Eisenhower didn't have the guts to stand up for what he knew was right. But Truman's anger went beyond personal betrayal. It struck at his core belief about leadership and accountability. For Truman, the presidency meant accepting responsibility for every decision, every policy, every action taken under your authority, regardless of political cost. This was the principle behind his famous motto, "The buck stops here," which he had displayed on his desk since 1945. Truman had demonstrated this principle repeatedly during his presidency. He had taken full responsibility for the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan, never wavering despite decades of criticism. He had accepted blame for the initial failures in Korea after North Korean forces invaded on June 25, 1950. He had stood behind his decision to fire MacArthur, even though it sent his approval ratings plummeting to 22%, the lowest of any president in modern polling history. Eisenhower's refusal to defend Marshall, to take responsibility for the policies he had supported and the people he had worked with, represented everything Truman despised: the politician's instinct to dodge, to equivocate, to sacrifice principle for advantage. Right at this critical midpoint in our story of presidential conflict and moral courage, take a moment to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and smash that like button to help others discover these powerful historical narratives. Share this video with someone who cares about leadership and integrity in public life, and leave a comment telling us which aspect of this Truman-Eisenhower confrontation you find most relevant to today's political world. The November 18, 1952, meeting at the White House was arranged as a standard transition briefing, but both men knew it would be anything but standard. Truman had prepared meticulously, assembling briefing books on Korea, on the Soviet nuclear program, on the delicate situation in Indochina where French forces were fighting Vietnamese communists, on the complex web of international commitments that defined America's role as leader of the free world. Eisenhower arrived with his team, including John Foster Dulles, his designated Secretary of State, but the meeting began with an icy formality that shocked the staff members present. According to accounts from Dean Acheson, Truman's Secretary of State who attended the meeting, and from Eisenhower's own later recollections, the two men barely made eye contact during the initial exchanges. Truman began the briefing with professional efficiency, walking Eisenhower through the most pressing national security challenges, but the tension was palpable, the warmth that had characterized their earlier relationship completely absent. When Truman raised the subject of Korea, where armistice negotiations had been dragging on at Panmunjom since July 1951, Eisenhower responded with barely concealed criticism of Truman's conduct of the war. When Truman explained the rationale behind limiting the war to prevent Soviet or Chinese escalation, Eisenhower's silence spoke volumes about his disagreement. The meeting, scheduled for an hour, ended after just 45 minutes, with both men eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of mutual resentment. But the real confrontation, the words that Truman said when Eisenhower refused to take the blame, came not in that formal meeting, but in the days and weeks that followed, in Truman's public statements and private conversations that revealed his moral outrage at what he saw as Eisenhower's cowardice. On November 25, 1952, just a week after the White House meeting, Truman gave a speech at the National War College in Washington where, without naming Eisenhower directly, he delivered a devastating critique of leaders who refuse accountability. "A leader who will not defend the people who served honorably under his command," Truman said, his voice sharp with controlled anger, "is not worthy of the trust the American people have placed in him. A man who stays silent when lies are told about his friends and colleagues, who sacrifices principle for political convenience, has failed the most basic test of character." Everyone in the room understood exactly whom Truman was describing. The speech was reported widely, and while some editorials criticized Truman for attacking the president-elect, many Americans, even some who had voted for Eisenhower, felt uncomfortable with his treatment of Marshall. In his personal diary on December 2, 1952, Truman wrote even more bluntly, "Eisenhower has proven himself a moral coward. He knows McCarthy is lying about Marshall. He knows the charges are false, but he won't say so because it might cost him politically. This is not leadership. This is the worst kind of political calculation, putting personal ambition above truth and loyalty." The fundamental disagreement between Truman and Eisenhower was about the nature of political responsibility in a democracy and whether leaders should prioritize honesty over political survival. Truman believed, with an almost religious fervor, that elected officials had a sacred obligation to tell the truth and accept blame for failures, even when doing so carried enormous political costs. This conviction was rooted in his upbringing in Independence, Missouri, where his mother taught him that a man's word was his bond, and in his experience in World War I, where he had commanded Battery D of the 129th Field Artillery in brutal fighting at the Meuse-Argonne. Truman had built his presidency on this foundation of accountability. When the post-war economy stumbled in 1946 and Republicans won control of Congress, he didn't blame Roosevelt's legacy, but accepted responsibility for the problems occurring on his watch. When his 1948 election prospects looked hopeless, and advisors urged him to moderate his civil rights stance to appeal to Southern voters, he refused and instead issued Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, desegregating the armed forces because it was the right thing to do. When Chinese forces intervened in Korea in November 1950, turning what had seemed like imminent victory into a desperate retreat, he publicly acknowledged the miscalculation rather than shifting blame to his generals. Eisenhower operated from a different philosophy, one shaped by his experience building and maintaining military coalitions, where success often depended on knowing when to compromise, when to remain silent, when to preserve relationships even at the cost of immediate moral clarity. Eisenhower's defenders, then and now, argue that his silence on McCarthy and Marshall was strategic rather than cowardly, that he believed he could be more effective in eventually discrediting McCarthy from the presidency than by engaging in a public fight during the campaign. And indeed, after becoming president on January 20, 1953, Eisenhower did work behind the scenes to undermine McCarthy, eventually contributing to the senator's downfall during the Army-McCarthy hearings in 1954. But to Truman, this justification was hollow, a rationalization for moral failure. In a letter to Dean Acheson dated January 15, 1953, just days before Eisenhower's inauguration, Truman wrote, "They say Eisenhower was playing a long game, that he needed to win the election before he could deal with McCarthy. But what good is winning an election if you've sold your soul to get there? Marshall gave Eisenhower everything, and when Marshall needed someone to stand up for him, Eisenhower calculated that his political future was more important than his mentor's reputation. That's not strategy. That's betrayal." The contrast between the two men's approaches became even more stark during the Inauguration Day ceremonies on January 20, 1953, when Truman and Eisenhower rode together from the White House to the Capitol in what observers described as the most uncomfortable journey in inaugural history, with both men staring straight ahead, speaking only when protocol absolutely demanded it, their mutual contempt apparent to everyone lining Pennsylvania Avenue. The aftermath of this confrontation shaped both men's legacies in ways they could not have anticipated in those bitter months of 1952 and 1953. Truman left office with approval ratings barely above 30%, widely considered a failed president who had lost China, stalemated in Korea, and allowed his administration to be penetrated by communist spies. Eisenhower entered office as a triumphant hero, promising to end the Korean War and restore dignity to the presidency. But history's judgment evolved dramatically over the following decades. Truman's stock rose steadily as historians came to appreciate his decisiveness, his willingness to make unpopular decisions like the Berlin airlift in 1948, the recognition of Israel 11 minutes after its declaration of independence on May 14, 1948, and the commitment of American forces to defend South Korea despite the enormous political risks. By the 1970s and 1980s, scholars consistently ranked Truman among the near-great presidents, praising precisely the qualities that had made him unpopular in his own time: his refusal to dodge responsibility, his blunt honesty, his moral courage in defending civil rights and confronting Soviet expansion. Eisenhower's historical reputation remained strong, his 8 years marked by peace and prosperity. But the Milwaukee incident remained a permanent stain, a moment when political calculation triumphed over personal loyalty and moral clarity. In his post-presidential years, Eisenhower defended his actions, arguing in his 1963 memoir, Mandate for Change, that public confrontation with McCarthy would have been counterproductive. But these explanations never fully erased the image of him standing silent while his mentor was slandered. The personal relationship between Truman and Eisenhower never recovered, remaining frozen in mutual resentment until Truman's death on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. They saw each other occasionally at state funerals and official functions, maintaining a frosty civility, but never achieving genuine reconciliation. At John F. Kennedy's funeral on November 25, 1963, they were photographed sitting in the same pew at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, both elderly men now, their faces etched with the weight of the years and decisions that had defined their era. But even in that moment of shared national grief, they barely acknowledged each other's presence. Eisenhower, who had suffered a series of heart attacks and strokes, died on March 28, 1969, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, and Truman, already in declining health himself at the Truman Library in Independence, issued only a brief, formal statement of condolence that mentioned their World War II collaboration, but pointedly omitted any personal warmth. The historical record suggests that Truman never forgave Eisenhower for what he saw as the fundamental betrayal of Marshall and the abandonment of the principle that leaders must defend truth regardless of political cost. In interviews given at the Truman Library in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when historians asked about Eisenhower, Truman's responses remained sharp and unforgiving, still animated by the anger he had felt 2 decades earlier, when he watched a man he had trusted sacrifice principle for ambition. As we close this examination of what Truman said when Eisenhower refused to take the blame, make sure you're subscribed to this channel for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped history. Hit that like button if this story gave you new insight into presidential leadership. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand the timeless tension between political pragmatism and moral courage. And tell us in the comments, what aspect of this Truman-Eisenhower confrontation resonates most powerfully with you in our current political moment? The lesson of that cold meeting on November 18, 1952, and the bitter words that followed, transcends the specific personalities and circumstances of mid-20th century America. It speaks to an eternal question that every leader must answer. When truth and political advantage conflict, which do you choose? Truman chose truth, even when it cost him approval ratings, congressional seats, and historical reputation in his own lifetime. Eisenhower chose political calculation, believing that the greater good justified temporary silence, that the presidency he could win was worth more than the mentor he failed to defend. History has rendered its verdict through the simple fact that Truman's name is now synonymous with accountability, while the Milwaukee incident remains an indelible blemish on Eisenhower's otherwise distinguished record. The buck, as Truman's famous sign declared, stopped somewhere, and in that winter of 1952, it stopped at Harry Truman's desk while Dwight Eisenhower looked away. What Truman said, ultimately, was that leadership without accountability is hollow, that loyalty to truth matters more than loyalty to party or personal ambition, and that the judgment of history belongs to those brave enough to accept blame, even when they could have easily deflected it. These words, spoken in anger but rooted in principle, echo still through the corridors of power, where every leader must eventually confront the same choice that divided these two titans: the easy path of political survival, or the hard road of moral